Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Tactics Board. I missed the last one due to illness, but we've had an early fitness test, and I'm raring to go for this one. Norwich City take on Sunderland at Carrow Road tomorrow evening. A tough task after a disappointing 2-1 loss to Plymouth, but it'll be interesting to see how Johannes Thorup reacts, whether he rips up his plan and starts again, as he suggested he might after the game. That's what we're going to touch on towards the back end of the episode, but it will be a theme throughout it when I take you through my predicted starting 11 for the game and look at Sunderland and some of the threats that they pose. But we're going to start with the players I think Torup will choose for the game. So without further ado, here's that lineup. So I've gone for Angus Gunn in goal, Jack Stacey at right wing back, Jakob Sorensen, Shane Duffy and Jose Cordoba in the centre of defence, with Kellen Fisher at left wing back, Kenny McLean and Marcelino Nunez through the middle in a 2, Ante Sienats on the right, Borja Sainz on the left and Josh Sargent through the middle up front. Now, one of the first things you'll have noticed is that is a sort of back 3, back 5 setup, and the main reason I've gone for that is how Torup went against West Brom. Of course, that was also a home game against a team currently in the playoff places. Feels like the circumstances are quite similar, and in fact, if Torup went quite defensive for that one, he may well be tempted to do so against the Black Cats, who have been even more impressive than West Brom this season. Of course, beat Norwich 2-1 in the reverse fixture, like to attack, like to dominate on the ball a lot of the time and have some real quality in offensive areas. So I think if Torup went defensive against West Brom, then that's something he might be tempted to do against Sunderland. Probably the Plymouth situation plays into that as well, and how badly burned they were when they tried to go back to a sort of attacking style of play. And although I think it might mark a slight backward step in the long term, Torup did seem pretty unhappy after the Plymouth game, and there probably will need to be some element of change in the short term, because you get the sense that fans are starting to lose a little bit of patience as well. So I think he will be tempted to do something a bit different, and what we saw against West Brom when he tried to do that was a back 5. So I've gone with that, and I've gone with the same back 5 actually that he deployed for that game. Of course, at Plymouth, Kellen Fisher wasn't as good on the left-hand side. Jack Stacey struggled a little bit in his more traditional right-back role, so Fisher was swapped at half-time. And although I was considering maybe predicting that Torup would do that, I thought Fisher was actually very good on the left-hand side in a back 5, in a wing-back position against West Brom, one of Norwich's better players on that afternoon. And although there will be a temptation to try to create the sort of crosses and circumstances that led to Josh Sargent's goal on the southwest coast, I think it will look slightly different this time because of the opposition, because of the fact that Norwich are at home again, and also because of the players available to Torup, because obviously Kenny McLean was the one who ended up playing at left back, so that Norwich had a more natural left footer against Plymouth, and I think he'll be needed in the midfield too if Torup does go to a back 5. I think you look at the types of players they have, maybe Jacob Wright could fit into that type of system, but otherwise there aren't many that could slot in alongside Nunez and play that role. He's got that more athletic, more physical style of play that I think you need if you're only going to have 2 in that midfield and surrender a bit of the sort of numerical dominance that they have when they have 3 in the middle. So I think it could be McLean and Nunez in there. If he does go with that system, obviously that's a 2 that we've seen at times under David Wagner and did the job a lot of the time there. So although it may be a bit functional in terms of the formation, I think that is a good blend, McLean and Nunez in there. And of the players available, I can't really see Torup going for something different unless he did want to play Kenny McLean on the left-hand side, Fisher on the right-hand side, and then probably introduce Jacob Wright into that midfield. And I thought he did make a real difference against Argyle, having watched that back. So Torup might be tempted to do that, but right now I'm marginally going for McLean in there. The front 3, I think, speaks for itself. Maybe a couple of them didn't have their best games on Saturday. Namely, Sainz, I think, wasn't great, but ultimately I don't see him dropping any of those, especially with Mate Jarasek suffering his latest injury, and it doesn't feel like Torup has many options. So I think that front 3 speaks for itself. it'll be interesting to see if I'm proven right in terms of the prediction of a back five, but I think there's a good chance of it after what happened against West Brom. Now on to Sunderland, and in a few ways they're quite hard to predict because what they've been very good at doing this season is adapting, changing their sort of style of play and their formation and the players they use depending on the opposition. It's not something they've had to do all the time because ultimately their squad is just a lot better than a lot of the teams in the Championship. But I think Norwich would fit into that bracket of teams they might have to slightly adapt for. And in terms of tactics, you'd say that that might mean actually going a bit more defensive. But if Norwich do that, then Sunderland will obviously feel that they maybe need to go and attack a little bit more, and that might play into Norwich's hands a little bit, but Sunderland are good at that. They have got players who can attack, who can get into good areas and produce that quality in the final third. So either way, they have the tactical flexibility to adapt and to counter what Norwich are going to try to do. So in a way, although Torup will be tempted to go a little bit less proactive and maybe try to defend for a lot of the game, it might suit Norwich more to make it about themselves. But either way, it's obviously a tough assignment when you're not in amazing form. You're playing a team who are confident that they can go on and be at least part of the promotion race in the last few weeks of the season. And I think it is difficult for a number of reasons. However, one thing that Sunderland have struggled against this season is back threes, and specifically 3-5-2 formations have been more difficult for them. But either way, against a back three, a back five, similarly to Norwich actually, that's something that at times they have struggled against. So if Norwich do try that formation, that might be a situation that Regis Lebris has fewer options to counter. But either way, they have been able to adapt at times this season. So ultimately a lot of it between the two head coaches tactically will be, rather than maybe how a lot of games play out these days in terms of the pre-match analysis and how you set your teams up and the ideas you have, a lot of it will be won and lost on adjusting to how the game is unfolding. And that's where maybe Torup's biggest task will be, rather than pre-match deciding what he does tactically. So it will be interesting to see how that battle unfolds. But again, there is that weakness against back threes and back fives that might play into Norwich's hands if they want to go with that slightly more defensive formation and those slightly more defensive tactics that they did use a couple of weeks ago, or what is it now, 10 days ago against West Brom. Now, I wanted to finish with a bit of a discussion about where Torup goes from here, because there were some pretty stern words after Plymouth. You can go back and watch those elsewhere on this channel. And he seemed to be referencing the fact that Norwich needed to almost turn the dial, that things needed to change, that he was going to go about changing those in the next few weeks and going into the summer. And he seemed mainly to be referencing players who wouldn't be here next season, wouldn't be at Norwich, and those who they almost needed to get rid of after an error-strewn performance against Argyle. So I wanted to explore what some of his options are going forward, and in these last few games to show fans that he's trying to change things. Now, the 11 that I've predicted maybe doesn't suggest that. I know people will be looking at that team going, there are several players there out of contract who will be leaving in the summer, who maybe aren't part of the long-term plans. But that's where sort of the problem is, and where Torup's between a rock and a hard place, because it feels like going for a more secure system where there's less of a chance of errors and Norwich can pack their own box and win those second balls and third balls as they didn't against Plymouth. They would need those more experienced characters in there. Shane Duffy in defence, Jakob Sorensen, who of course, as it stands, is out of contract in the summer. Kenny McLean in there as well, who's obviously the club captain, and we'll see what happens with him, but isn't currently out of contract. But I know there are a few people who would like to see a younger player in his position, maybe Jacob Wright, used a little bit more. And that's where the problem comes for Torup, because if you want to go solid, if you want to go a little bit more safety first and have an insurance policy, then you have to go with those players who are a bit more experienced, whose ceiling maybe at this point in their career isn't quite as high as some of their teammates. The alternative is to give fans and a lot of people what they want in terms of starting the likes of Oscar Schwartau, maybe a Mankwa Forsen, going with a bit more of a youthful attacking system. But then if you do that, you leave yourself open to even more criticism and even worse performance than they produced against Plymouth. And that's where the problem is for Torup. So I think a lot of it will be around the edges, and that's quite a difficult position for Torup to be in going into these last few games of the season. You don't really want to confuse those players or confuse the message going into next season. And that's where I still think Torup has the same decision on his plate that he has for the last few weeks, really, in terms of, do you go all in for the long term, almost use this as a bit of an advanced start on pre-season, start players who are very likely to be at Norwich next season, or do you go solid, try to cut out the areas, because he did seem like somebody who was quite fed up after that Plymouth game. So it'll be interesting to see which choice he makes. That's a choice that it seems he's gone sort of up and down with when you look at the way they set up for West Brom, the way they set up for Plymouth, and I think this will tell us a lot how they set up to face Sunderland. So that'll be an interesting one, and of course we'll have every kick of the game covered across our channels. So go to pinkham.com/subscribe if you haven't already, and you'll have access to all of our content. Thank you very much for joining me on Tactics Board. I'll see you again very soon when hopefully the tone is much more positive than it is after that dreadful loss to Plymouth.